This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
How much do you know about Waitangi Day and the Waitangi Tribunal? Today, to mark Waitangi Day 2026, we are discussing all things Waitangi Tribunal with Professor Jacinta Ruru. Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and mātauranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the OI special Waitangi Day episode. Who or what is the Waitangi Tribunal? Why is it important? Why was it formed? How does it function? What has the Waitangi Tribunal achieved? Is it still needed, and where to from here? Wow, I feel like that is the most times I have ever said Waitangi in a sentence. Hi, I'm Dr Barb, a quantitative ecologist with a background in modelling, climate change, biodiversity, conservation prioritisation and SciComm, and a PhD in botany from Ōtākau Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the OI podcast, the podcast for discerning listeners. We hope you enjoy our mix of conversations with experts in a range of subjects as we from the worlds of art, sciences and mātauranga Māori. Today's topic is the Waitangi Tribunal, and we are joined in the studio by Professor Jacinta Ruru from our very own Ōtākau Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago. And thank you so much for joining us, Jacinta.
Oh, thank you. Kia ora koutou, tēnā koe. It's awesome to be here. I'm thrilled to be sitting here with you today.
It's fabulous. Hey, I've got a little introduction to you, and there are a lot of accolades to list on there. Professor Jacinta Ruru. Now, Raukawa Ngāti Ranganui?
Yes, that's correct. 2 iwi in the North Island.
But you're here in the South Island.
Yeah, grew up here in the South Island. So Dad grew up right next door to his marae, which is about 5 k's north of Tido, so in that Waikato, Cambridge area. Paparamu marae. He was one of the younger of a big family, lots of siblings. And then he met my mum, who grew up in New Plymouth, and they travelled around, and my dad came down to the South Island and saw those big, beautiful mountains in that Queenstown, Glenorchy area, and convinced my mum that it would be quite a good idea to go down to the South Island. And so some of my early years were growing up in Glenorchy.
Just across the hill from me.
It's a beautiful place, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely beautiful place to grow up with. And you're right, all those beautiful mountains there. No, it's fantastic. So down here, so it's a kind of an interesting twist on the iwi relations there. We'll get to that later. Professor Ruru is a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for Services to Māori and Law, a fellow for the Royal Society of New Zealand, and in March 2024 you were appointed the inaugural Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori, a position which provides strategic advice to whakamana I te Tiriti or Waitangi in all operations across the university. So you're absolutely the right person to join us here for this Waitangi Day special.
It's great to be here. I'm really thrilled. It's a great opportunity to talk through te Tiriti or Waitangi, where we've been, and our hopes and aspirations for the future.
Yeah, no, it's and we'll get to both that, because I think in order to talk about the Waitangi Tribunal, first we need to talk about the Treaty of Waitangi, or te Tiriti or Waitangi. And it's also that, obviously, the two faces of it, the English written face, which for a long time was the face that was sort of popularised, and of course the Te Reo Māori face, and the interaction between those and the differences between them, and the controversy and anguish which that's caused over the years to pretty much everyone involved, I think. I was going to go through your many merits here. So Professor Ruru holds a BA from Victoria University, Wellington, and then an LLB from Otago here, and then a PhD from Victoria, but not in New Zealand, in Canada. How did that come about?
Well, That's quite an amazing story, really. It's something very special to me. As I'd already started so I'd completed my Masters of Law at the University of Otago, and I was offered this assistant lecturer position in the law school, and then came on to be a lecturer. So it just started, really, an early career academic. It would have been in the when was it? In the late 1999, early 2000s. And I started sitting in the 8th floor of the law library, and you're reading all these law journals, which are very much about our discipline of law around property and jurisprudence and torts and criminal law and so on. And in amongst reading these journal articles, I saw an article by an Indigenous law professor based in Canada, which that was quite unusual in itself, to have an Indigenous legal expert based in Canada. And he is Anishinaabe, so one of the Indigenous First Nations tribes, iwi, over there in Canada. And he was writing in this law journal about his dreams and his hopes and his aspirations. And he was very much talking about his understanding of law from the first person, from his family's experience of growing up on a reserve. It was quite different writing. It was very innovative. And I thought this was just incredible, and I really wanted to meet him. And then at the University of Otago, we were hosting the Supreme Court Justice, the big boss of the Canada the Canada Supreme Court, Beverly McLaughlin. And I had this opportunity to sit next to her for dinner. I was very tongue-tied. Sat next to her for a short period of the dinner. And I expressed to her that I'd been reading this work of John Burroughs, Professor John Burroughs, and she said, "Oh, I know John." And she actually went back to Canada and sent an email or a note to this professor and said, "Oh, there's this person, this young woman in New Zealand who really wants to study under you." And so John got in touch with me, and that has ever since been this incredible connection and relationship, really, around what's possible for our legal system. And I was lucky enough to do my PhD under his supervision.
Oh, fantastic. And did you always want to study law? Did you come to university thinking, I want to be a lawyer? Where did that come from, that?
Yeah, no, not at all. So grew up around that Glenorchy, Queenstown, Cromwell area. Neither of my parents actually finished secondary school. Neither of them went on to university. I knew very few people who had studied at university. Both my parents, though, instilled in my brother and sister and I the importance of education, that education creates opportunities in one's life. And so I really only had this notion that I was going to go to university, and there was no pressure on me to study. No one really, it was just like the success was actually going to university. And so my driver going into university, that I was going to take subjects that I didn't have an opportunity to take at school. Mm-hmm. So I took politics, Māori studies, sociology, education. And so I was working towards a Māori studies politics degree. And it wasn't until my third year of that BA degree that I took first year law. And it was really just meant to be as another paper to supplement my politics degree. And I loved it. I loved what I could see in first year law was something I couldn't see at the time in my politics degree. I'd always been very interested in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, what that meant for us as a country. And there it was in my first year law talking about the treaty. And I was like, I want to know more. And so I completed my law degree and I've never left.
That's quite amazing. Why Victoria? Why not Otago?
I was following a boyfriend.
It's not all bad. You can do it sometimes.
And so, and I really wanted to be on Wellington too. I think I was thinking about politics. I was doing my political degree.
You were going there for a political degree.
I was.
That's interesting. So no political aspirations then?
No, not at all. I was just really interested in the study. I think if I had any kind of career aspiration in my later years of high school, it was more to be maybe a documentary maker. Always very interested in New Zealand history. I felt that history, and I really wished to know more and to explore more.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And what a wonderful thing it is that you've gone into law, because it's all these accolades, but also, you are fantastic there. And you're here now at the University of Otago, and you've moved up. You've had distinguished recognition for research, teaching and service all the way through the Prime Minister's Supreme Award for Excellence in Tertiary Teaching, the Fulbright Ngā Pai o te Matanga Senior Māori Scholar and TEDx speaker. What is a TEDx speaker? How do you get to be there? I mean, they're the people on YouTube, but how do you get to do that?
Oh, that was the most nerve-wracking experience. And so I had this invitation come through on my email to do a TEDx talk, which I think was maybe about... I can't quite remember now, maybe about 14 minutes long. And I said yes, because I thought I'd learned the trick on how to memorise a 14-minute speech. And of course, there's no tricks. You just really need to write your speech and you just need to learn it. And so a group of us went through to Christchurch and they set the stage up like a TEDx stage with an amazing audience in the room, and we each had our opportunity to stand there on the stage with no notes but a very strict timeline to be able to explore a central idea.
Wow, and what was your idea?
So I talked about legal personality. So at the time, our legal system was looking at how to recognise, how do we compensate for the past wrongs? So we know that land has been forcibly taken from iwi Māori from 1840 onwards. And if we are as a country now looking at reconciliation and recognising the wrongs of our past, how do we make that right? And particularly a lot of my research work has been looking at and arguing that we have an opportunity, particularly with our lands that are in public lands. So they're not privately owned lands. They're lands that are held by the Crown for public use. And particularly a third of our country falls into that category of publicly owned lands, and that's our conservation estate. And so we have our conservation estate, and particularly our national parks, as these like jewels in the crown. They're there for tourism, for public enjoyment, and for scientific benefit. And if we have these areas that are incredibly special to Māori, where Māori often get a lot of their identity derives from these lands, can we have a meeting of the minds? Can we have a coming together of kind of Western ideas of caring for lands and a Māori idea for caring for lands? And that legal personality, I feel, is sort of a meeting in the middle, an opportunity where we say, actually, this land isn't necessarily owned by the Crown and it's not necessarily owned by Māori. We kind of remove that ownership issue and we say that these lands, these waters, these rivers, these forests are their own being. They are their own personality. They have their own mana, let's say. They have their own authority. And we can actually recognise these areas as having their own, we call them legal persons, which means that they have their own rights, responsibilities and duties. And we can make the law work to make that a reality. And we did here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which was quite exciting at the time and continues to be exciting.
And so we have a couple of those already, don't we? Do you want to list those off there?
Yeah, so we started with, as a country, the Crown went into negotiations with Tūhoi on the east coast of the North Island there for Te Urewera, which was one of our national parks. And so in 2014, that Te Urewera became now not a national park. Instead, it becomes an area that is known as its own legal personality, its own person. So Te Urewera was first, then the Whanganui River, our third longest river in Aotearoa, New Zealand, had that recognition. I think that was 2017. And then more recently, just a year or two ago, Mount Taranaki, that Taranaki, Mount Egmont, was encased in a national park status. That was our second national park to be created in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the early 1900s. And that maunga, that mountain now, is recognised as a legal person. And look, there's people around the world looking at this model here in New Zealand. It's not completely novel as an idea. It's an idea that a professor of law over in America, Professor Christopher Stone, he had this idea of legal personality of the environment, and particularly from that USA perspective, what he was arguing for, he wrote this beautiful book, Trees Ought to Have Standing, is the idea that we should give voice to the environment in the court. So if there is a court dispute around how land or water is to be used, then we should have legal representation for the trees and for the mountains. And this was an idea Christopher Stone was working on in the 1970s. And we've adapted that. But the important point when people look to New Zealand, to Aotearoa, and see what we have done, is we haven't just taken that idea of Christopher Stone, because remember, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we already had the highest level of protection here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Those lands were already national parks. They were to be preserved in perpetuity for all time. So what we did here was this, looking at a Māori way. We brought our starting off point here for legal personality was actually, we're looking at a Māori way of understanding the world. Māori have already personified the environment. This makes sense from a Māori point of view to recognise Te Urewera as the heart of the fish of Te Ika Maui. We're recognising that. And so, yeah, it's something completely different that we're doing here in New Zealand. And I think that leads in really nicely in terms of thinking about where we are as a country, our opportunities under Te Tiriti or Waitangi and so on.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's quite, long-term listeners will have heard me wax lyrical about, I think, that species should have legal copyright to their images. So anyone who's selling Kiwi shoe polish, for instance, should have to pay copyright for the image to the Kiwi. And someone would, run that trust for them, but the money should be used for the Kiwi, and maybe the Kiwi wants to share with some of its lesser-known friends. But I think all of those things, we're using the iconology, the images of beings, and I think they should own their own copyright. But that's a little bit of a side issue.
No, well, it's not really. It's a wonderful idea, and it's a real... It's that recognition, and particularly if we think about the Kiwi, for example, from a Māori idea, that is one of our relations. We have responsibilities. The Kiwi is a tuakana. It's one of our relations. We have so much to learn from the Kiwi, and how we could maybe, think about how our law can make sense here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and particularly for species that are threatened. We are needing to think about how to generate more resources, into our economy for restoration of our bird species, of our lands and of our waters. It's quite a novel idea. It's interesting. I'm going to think more about that.
I think, well, anyway, that's my contribution to it. But I mean, of course it has precedence, right? Because we already have, legal, like minorities, for instance, like not racial minorities, but young people, when they go to family court, we don't expect them to look after their own best interests. We appoint legal representation that works in their best interests. And I think that, that the whole kind of, if you start to think of the whole system a little bit more kind of holistically outside the box of what we kind of think of it, there is lots of precedent there for all these issues. It's just a matter of having sort of a flexible mind and, thinking perhaps of what the final goal is and having that kind of idea of fairness and, trying to make things work in a way that works out to be fair. But I did say to people that I would talk about the Waitangi Tribunal. Sorry, did you have last thoughts?
Just to say, look, that deeply resonates with me and what you are saying. I love what you're thinking there, and that we do have these opportunities. For me, when I think about law, the law here needs to make sense for Aotearoa New Zealand. It's come from the common law of England, but we've got an opportunity to make it distinctive to these lands here. And so we do have the opportunity to be, to really think holistically, to think innovatively around how we put together the puzzle that makes sense for Aotearoa New Zealand, and how we care for one another, and how we care for these lands and waters.
And I know that, well, I don't know because I don't actually know them, but my forefathers and foremothers, I guess, as well, generally, when they were coming here from wherever, from the Shetland Islands, from England, Wales, all of those places, they were coming for a better life, for a different life, for, maybe adventure, maybe something different. But by and large, they were coming for the difference, for the challenge, for the uniqueness of it. So hanging on to things that may no longer serve doesn't really seem to have been in the ideology even of the people coming to New Zealand at whatever stage in the kind of settlement of New Zealand. It's, it seems like as a community, we have a chance to take what's useful, build on that, and the things that are maybe not so useful anymore, just say, okay, well, they're maybe not so useful anymore. And I think us maybe not having a written constitution, because that can get sort of set in stone in a time and in a phase of kind of the evolution of us as a community that no longer really resonates with the people today. And, we've seen how society changes. We know that the things that we as a society and a community value today may not be the same as they were, 150, 200, 300, however many hundreds of years ago. We change because, we know different people and things change. And, lots of that is for the better, the way that, European missionaries treated women, possibly Victorian methods, and, it's all kind of embedded in that kind of time of when those big interactions between European society and Maori society were coming back. A lot of that isn't really about Western society, I think, or Maori society. It's about the time that interaction happened, which was very much a Victorian society, which is, I don't know, there's not a lot of me that resonates with kind of Victorian society. So I think might be quite good now to take a step back and just think about the Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And what amazes me always is that it's such a simple document. It just has those 3 articles.
It is a really simple document. It's written in English and te reo Māori, so it's easily accessible. I encourage everyone who hasn't had an opportunity yet to have taken the opportunity to have a look online, to read Te Tiriti or Waitangi, to go to Te Papa and see it, on the big walls there.
And we will put the link to that in the episode description here, so it will be very easy for everyone to find. And also the link about the Waitangi Tribunal as well. So that's all going to be there. And it is very easy to find. And it's very simple, and it's one page. I sort of think that every school and community board and library could just have it framed on the wall, because it is so small, like short.
It is. It is really accessible, and it is, I believe it is one of our most important documents that's sort of founding our modern nation. It's a document where it's where Māori are welcoming in to the English, to be here on these lands of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in amongst all there, there's, as we know, there's maybe misconceptions and misunderstandings, and certainly by the New Zealand government in the years immediately following the signing of the Te Tiriti or Waitangi, there's a deliberate move away from the intent of that document. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, we're coming up to, it's more than 180 years since the signing.
Amazing.
2040 is will mark the 200th anniversary. And I think that's a date that a lot of us are really thinking about is 2040. What will our country look like?
Yeah.
What will our nation look like? For me, when I think about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, I think it's really important to kind of understand or try to understand what was going on in these lands in that February 1840. And I often emphasise, particularly to my students who are coming through and learning about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, sometimes for the first time, particularly from a legal sense, is that there had already been 70 years of interaction between Māori and the English here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And if we look back to all those English written records around their interaction with Māori here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is very, very clear recognition that Māori have authority over these lands, and that there, for example, there are orders from England that they're not able to land their ships, they're not allowed to anchor their ships here on the shores of Aotearoa, New Zealand, without the express permission of the Māori chiefs. So that's like in the 1820s and so on. So there's a long record, 70 years of the English recognising the authority of Māori over these lands. Māori is the dominant language. From 1815 we have Māori in a written form, but prior to then, all the work of the missionaries and so on that you just mentioned, it's all in Te Reo Māori. The Bible's been translated into Te Reo Māori. So by the time we get to 1840, which is 5 years after the Declaration of Independence has already been signed, which recognised Māori have sovereignty over these lands, the Te Tiriti o Waitangi is that recognition of Māori authority over these lands. There was nothing new to Māori there. Of course, any people would never give away their sovereignty, and there was no need for Māori to give away their sovereignty. From a Māori perspective, that's recognising their authority over these lands, but welcoming the English to also be here in these lands, and particularly for the English to have more control over the English who are arriving here in New Zealand. Mostly at that time, it's a lot of English men. They've come on those ships for a very long time, sailing those waters, and arriving here on these lands And there just needed to be some English law and order, I think, in place there. And so Māori agree to that signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. It recognises their sovereignty clearly, and it also clearly recognises that they are the owners of all of these lands, that they're the owners, that all their property remains their property, the forests, the fisheries, the lands, until which point Māori wish to sell their land. And the Treaty of Waitangi makes it clear that Māori are agreeing that they will only sell that land to the Crown, and the Crown will then be that body who will put that what was Māori customary land into a 10-year system, into an English 10-year system with a certificate of title and so on. That's going to make sense to the English, the Europeans who are arriving on those ships, including here in Ōtepoti, Dunedin in the 1840s, where they can then purchase from the Crown directly. They don't need to go into direct negotiations with Māori.
So sort of getting rid of that land speculation type thing, and kind of the Crown taking charge of their own English subjects and saying, okay, there's more English people here now, and they are, some of them are going out there and causing strife and friction, and, we need to make sure that the English are actually behaving in a way that's kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. So that's 1840 Aotearoa. Māori are the dominant population.
And it's interesting what you're saying there about everyone spoke Māori. Māori
Yes.
was the language. And we had Professor Lockie Patterson on, and he was talking about the early Māori newspapers and how many newspapers in Te Reo Māori there were, and that whole kind of written language had really kind of just gone just like that so quickly that once there was a written language and it was very clear to Māori that this was a great idea, it was easy to move ideas around, it was easy to talk about things. And I think today, in today's kind of society, we've kind of a little bit lost that perspective that of the relative population size of English and Māori and the relative frequency of the two languages there. And I think that kind of clouds our vision of the English and the Te Reo Māori versions of Te Tiriti or Waitangi.
We were a confidently bilingual country right through until 1870s, 1880s. You know, Māori is the dominant language of exchange, certainly up to that 1840 point in the 1850s. Māori adapted really quickly to that written language. It's a very dominant part of society.
And I guess it's possible to even think that the English version was kind of a bit of an afterthought. So maybe the translation wasn't super great because everybody practically signed the Te Reo Māori version. So there was a few rangatira that signed the English version, but most of the rangatira signing or Te Tiriti or Waitangi were actually signing the Te Reo Māori version.
Absolutely. All those negotiations at Waitangi itself on the 5th, 6th of February, and then as the treaty, the versions were taken around the North Island and the South Island. It's the Māori version that's being discussed. It's the Māori version that's being signed.
And it's quite possible, I guess, then that many of those rangatira never actually even had the opportunity to see the English version because there was am I right there? There's a bunch of versions that were transcribed in Te Reo Māori, and then there was the one kind of extra version that they and I don't even know why they did it. Was that?
Well, you can just imagine back then, in terms of transport, they would have been using the boats or horses and so on, travelling around through the country. I mean, there's still parts of the country that the Europeans had never even been into and don't even go into until like the 1860s. So 20 years after that initial signing of the Treaty of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Europeans hadn't been into that whole Queenstown area, hadn't been onto that whole east coast of the North Island. So there is large tracts of the land that the Europeans may have gone around some of the coastlines, slightly maybe inland a little bit, but not much at all. And so these are lands that were extremely well known to Māori, knew these lands, had all their stories, everything was about these lands. And the Europeans were slow to start to, after, from the late 1700s, were very slow to engage with these lands and to know these lands.
And I think the other thing that surprises me sometimes is the sheer number of signatories to the Treaty of Waitangi, and to me, I guess that it's very clear that neither of the parties to that treaty were thinking of Māori as one entity. Because if they were, why would they have sent the document around and had 500 plus people sign it? That's not something that you would do. You would say, okay, who's your representative? Sign this, and then that's the way it is. So it was clear that it was a document between the entity of the Crown and each individual
sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And so that is, thank you for making that point. It's a really excellent point. So Māori would never have seen themselves as one big people, and always defined themselves around very strong national boundaries, geographical boundaries. So it was, the country was made up of a number of different independent Māori national entities. I often think of the students. I think students to go to like Europe and look at the map of Europe and so on. It's one landmass, but there's different countries in there. And that's how Māori would have understood themselves as well back in, prior to 1840.
When you compare it to that kind of European boundary, it's very obvious that we think, who's the president of Europe? It's not a single person. We don't ask the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to sign for Italy or Spain or whatever.
Imagine.
Yeah. But the other thing that's interesting is that they do come together as a group and discuss things that are of interest to them as a group, and they all have their say, and that is the European Union. So you could think of Maori more in that kind of strategic alliance type idea, that they had similar issues with Europeans coming, mainly English, coming onto the land and doing whatever, and they had similar challenges with these people that were coming here, and they maybe thought that actually having a simple kind of set of...
So back in 1835, so 5 years before the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, 1835, the Declaration of Independence, He Whakaputanga, is signed, and that explicitly states about these different Māori nations coming together annually. So they talk about it once a year. They need to come from across the country. Their chiefs need to come together, and they need and there's this desire to be working together to set the framework of the laws for the country. So they're talking there about Māori laws for the country. And so He Whakaputanga is an 1835 document written in both Māori and English, clearly sets out that intent. Then we have the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840. And then following there, we have, particularly in response to the New Zealand wars in that Waikato area, we have the rise of the kingitanga.
So those New Zealand wars, that's sort of the 1860s, 1840s, 1850s, or is it that early?
It starts from around the mid-1840s. Definitely into the 1850s, 1860s.
So it's quite a long sort of envelope there of time, really. And it kind of, I don't know, where did it all start going wrong?
I think so when you start to examine the documents and so on, particularly coming from England, right up to, so this is from late 1700s, all that early 1800s, The change is quite remarkable. It happens quite swiftly. It's about 1858, and for the first time we see in those English documents in 1838 a desire for England to have New Zealand as a colony.
Right.
Initially, maybe just part of the New South Wales colony. That's
I've seen lots of Australian friends who say, we still got space in our little constitution.
Yes.
If you want to be another state, I thought, who? Why? I don't think anyone's asking for that. Just as an aside, but it does actually make you think that's where the English part of that, and I say English, but I guess it was the British part of that treaty was coming from, and I'm just aware of. I could talk to you all day about.
They wanted land, and they wanted land. As you were saying before, there's that promise of people are leaving Britain. Some of our ancestors and so on, they are leaving, and they are leaving purposely, and they're being promised a better land, a better life. They're subjecting themselves, their families, children, to months and months on those ships. They're arriving here in the hundreds in the 1840s. They've been promised land. The government's trying to convince Māori to sell their land. Māori don't want to sell their land, not great big, tracts of it. Why would they want to? They've got no need to do so. And so there's friction, there's conflict that starts to arise. And so the Crown then starts to use force. So you have military force starting to be used. And then you have the legislation coming in. So they start to introduce colonial laws that are very much supportive of the colonial aspirations for the country to succeed in that New Zealand war.
And then fast forward to, it's not until the 1970s, 1975, which is quite some time later, that we have the Waitangi Tribunal set up. And that's specific, so there's a big gap in there that we'll leave for another show, and we'll just jump straight into the Waitangi Tribunal. Why was it set up? What's the foundation for that?
Look, I think many of your listeners will understand this maybe better than me, but so it's 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established, and I try and get my students to think, what's happening in the country in the late 1960s, 1970s?
Flower power. It's all about revolution. It's all about that whole kind of freedom, and it really is. And do you know what I think it is? I put it all down to the contraceptive pill.
It could be a part of it. I've never had a student say that. but it is that is a revolution time. So Māori have been protesting all the way along from 1840. You've got Māori using all sorts of means to protest. They're writing petitions. They're taking it over to the king, the queen in England. They're doing occupations.
And of course, parehaka.
Exactly. So absolutely. So Māori are protesting all that way through. So what happens? Why is it that New Zealand society sees this really as a mess, as a country for the first time in the late 1960s, early 70s? Partly it's because of television. We've now got television screens and people have televisions in their homes. They're actually seeing visibly some of these protests. We're seeing what's happening in the United States.
Protests against the
Vietnam
Vietnam War.
Yep, Vietnam War. And then you have the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and so on. You have the Rosa Parks incident on the bus and so on. So we're starting to raise our consciousness of that. And then we have apartheid over in South Africa and the rise of that. And there's this notion that we have all been sort of brought up with here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that we've got the best race relations in the world. Yeah. And we're certainly better than Australia. So we were brought up with that whole notion.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, but I think that moment started to come in the 1960s, 70s, are we any better? Are we any different? What's happening here? Let's set up this Waitangi Tribunal. Mm-hmm. And the Waitangi Tribunal originally in 1975 had no power to look back at historical wrongs. It only had the power to look at what was the government doing right now, like in the 1970s, early 80s, what was it doing that was in breach of the Treaty of Waitangi? So I think we kind of forget that the Waitangi Tribunal had a very contemporary focus. There was a recognition that the Crown was still breaching the Treaty of Waitangi, and we wanted to do better as a country. Let's put in place a permanent commission of inquiry, which is what the Waitangi Tribunal is.
It's interesting, that permanent commission of inquiry, because it's kind of a recognition that this is something that's going to be there and is going to always be needed, and it's not just kind of a come and go thing. So in a way, I mean, it's a bit crazy to think, okay, we're just going to start here, and we've had all these decades and decades that we're acknowledging that we were in breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. We've done lots of these breaches, but we're just saying, okay, that's too difficult. We're just going to wipe the slate clean and start again, and sorry about all that, guys. And, I'm paraphrasing here because, of course, nobody said sorry about that, all guys. But it was at least an acknowledgement then that this is something that's going to need to be ongoing, that this treaty continues. This is a treaty it's not a thing that you can do and it's done. It's a thing that goes on, because we need to be ensuring that we're continuing to honour this treaty that we've signed. So it's actually quite an interesting starting point in a way, despite the obvious omission of not trying to rectify anything in the very many decades that had followed up to there.
It is. It's about relationship building. Yeah. It was recognising back then we have in a simplistic sort of term, these two parties to the treaty, and that we have to be able to work together, and that we've actually got huge opportunities as a country if we do work together really well. So working together, and for a contemporary forward-looking focus, is a really important investment into our country. And so the Waitangi Tribunal was established very much with those confidently in those bicultural components. So his te reo Māori is utilised. They have Māori and Pākehā members on that Commission of Inquiry. You have a mix of people with different backgrounds. So some will have a law background, but some will have maybe a history, anthropology, or a political background. So it's kind of a group of New Zealanders with some expertise working together to initially look at how the government might now, currently, at that time, be breaching the treaty and putting forward some recommendations like, hey, how about doing it this way? How about thinking about this? Which is a really useful thing, I think, for any society. And then in the mid-1980s, that the usefulness of that tribunal was recognised and its power was made retrospective to look back from 1840 up to kind of 1992 into the 1990s around, and that was kind of declared as the historical breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. And again, to make recommendations, mostly its power is only to make recommendations.
Right.
So it makes these recommendations to the government.
But it has quite a lot of investigation type power to kind of collate all of the information and the evidence about from the time and the place and all the sides and everyone who's involved in whatever the claims are, and then kind of collate them all together and look at them from those various points that you were saying, the sociological, historical, legal, and from an unbiased. I mean, I think it's quite well established that the the Waitangi Tribunal should not be party political, in that it shouldn't be, active politicians on it.
I think it's done a really good job in doing that too. So it does take its task very seriously. It can take a number of years to complete an inquiry, and it makes its recommendations to the Crown. And sometimes the Crown accepts them and sometimes the Crown does not. But the usefulness, I think, for us as a nation is there's a record, there's a historical record. They're really accessible to read. Like, they're published in these reports, chapters, and there's often I like maps. So there's often maps of areas and images, and they are a solid report. You can download them off the internet. I think there has been a lost opportunity for us as New Zealanders, more broadly, to. I think if more New Zealanders had had the opportunity just to sit in on some of those tribunal inquiries, those inquiries are held at marae, at town halls, libraries, lots of different public spaces. I think it would have been wonderful, I think, if, and continuing on now, if we as New Zealanders could be more curious about the work of the tribunal, to sit in on and listen to.
Imagine if that was part of our education system. Imagine if during your high school years, everyone had, of our age, because we were going through high school at that time, if we'd had the opportunity as part of our social studies or history or whatever to go along and just sit in on, it wouldn't really matter which one, but one or other of those tribunal oral discussions, and just get that foundation there. Just moving on, what has the Waitangi Tribunal achieved, and how many of those claims are left up in the air? Where are we from here?
So I think we should be incredibly proud as a nation of the Waitangi Tribunal. I know countries around the world look to us in terms of what we've done with the tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal last year celebrated its 50th anniversary, and I really hope as a nation we keep the tribunal going for another 50 years and more. It needs to be with us as a nation. So as iwi Māori, you've got a choice. You don't need to go to the Waitangi Tribunal. You can go into direct negotiations with the government. But many have gone through the tribunal process because, as you said, it creates this incredible record of evidence. It spends years there making inquiries, deeply understanding from experts, from kaumātua elders, really trying to understand what happened, what really did happen, as much as we can understand that as possible. If that's a historical claim, and then there's still contemporary claims that are ongoing now. So the most important thing I think the tribunal has done is just amassed this most valuable collection of knowledge for us, and has walked side by side, us as New Zealanders and the government, for how we can reconcile, how we can accept the history, recognise the history, see the history of what's happened in our country, and how we can help to make amends, how we can create a future together that is more connected, more respectful, more inspiring for everyone. And I think we all want all New Zealanders to succeed. And I think an important part of that is to understand how Māori, the experience of Māori in these lands, and if we have Māori succeeding, it's going to help all of us as a country succeed. And we can just look at the demographics. The Māori population is fast rising, so it matters that Māori are healthy and well. It's becoming a substantial part of our population. The Māori economy is booming. It's worth billions, and it is still the fastest rising component of our economy right now. So that makes sense that Māori they're investing so much into this country financially. Māori are they're setting up companies and so on. We'll be working with Māori. We need this country to be doing the best that it can, and I think the Waitangi Tribunal is an important part of that.
And I guess also involved in that is the sort of the resurgence or the renaissance of Te Reo Māori, because of course there were always Te Reo Māori speakers, but that's had a big push of lately. And I think one of the things that a lot of people maybe don't realise is that written record. And of course, I did want to, just in our last minute here, say huge congratulations, because you are on the long list for the Ockham New Zealand Book Awards with your Books of Mana, 180 Māori-authored books of significance. And of course, it's co-authored with Angela Wanhala and Jeanette Wikaira. But congratulations, that's huge. And what a huge amount of work to pull that together. But it shows just how significant that body of literature is there.
Yeah, so this is a book that celebrates 200 years of Māori writing, and particularly we took a spotlight on how Māori have been writing books. So it's an incredible collated list of 180 books, non-fiction, that Māori have been writing. In those books from 1815 onwards, is this Māori generosity of sharing knowledge with anyone who's interested in reading any of these books. So it's a beautiful book. We're really proud of it. It explores many different themes that come to light when we bring together 180 books. Even just when you bring those beautiful front covers together.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Hey, I would love to have you and any or all of your co-authors along, and we could do just like a 3-part series with all of you, just talking about all the amazing books that are in there. Thank you very much for joining us here in the studio today, Jacinta. You've been listening to the OI podcast with Dr Barb in conversation with Professor Jacinta Ruru. If you've enjoyed this episode, we think you'll enjoy Indigenising Archaeology with Rachel Wesley, Edward Ellison's election special, or Maori language newspapers with Prof Lockie Patterson, and of course Reflections on Waitangi Day from last year, 2025, with Materia Ture. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.